I think that the theme for this conference gets at the core of some of the most fundamental problems that we are wrestling with in the various fields and areas of concern in education. I think issues of culture and heritage are central to our understanding of how people learn. There are a variety of kinds of research projects that relate to the themes. In the world of science education, there's some very interesting work going on around the uses of indigenous knowledge systems in science education. This would include the work of people like Megan Bang, Doug Nadine, that has a social justice mission, but certainly is very much involved in ways of using language, routine kinds of intergenerational practices in terms of children's relationship with the natural world and what that means for schooling. In mathematics, there's the Algebra Project founded by Bob Moses, which infuses issues of social justice into the teaching of mathematics. I would hope my own work in cultural modeling, where we focus on working in schools to draw on language practices and kids' engagement with everyday narrative texts as a way to sort of scaffold and build dispositions for wrestling with problems in canonical works of literature. There are wide bodies of research where there's a lot of sort of surface attention to the role of culture, the role of language, but it is still very much of an uphill battle in terms of really a broad acceptance of that work. I think that when you look at what's going on in terms of assessments that are intended to try to capture what kids know and are able to do, it tends to have a very restrictive focus about the ways in which kids can display their understandings. I think particularly in the STEM areas that this is particularly challenging. And I also think that there is a broad orientation in terms of a human development perspective on learning that tends to have a deficit orientation and not understanding that to be human is to be at risk. So the terminologies that we typically use for populations, particularly populations living in poverty and particular, ethnic and racial groups, there's a tendency in our communities of research to sort of characterize them as people of color, as though white people don't have color, as being placed at risk, as though they're human beings who are not at risk. They're all human beings are at risk. And often I think people think that if you're going to address issues having to do with social justice, that it's typically going to be theoretical and kind of based in sort of critical theorizing, but not based in empirical work. And what I hope is that while obviously there will be a place for powerful theorizing that's absolutely necessary, that people will also sort of wrestle with, as they look at the designs of studies in which they're working, about what are the underlying assumptions that inform the questions that are asked, the data that's collected, the way data is analyzed, for what are often very tacit assumptions about difference as deficit, about people who are to be fixed, and that often lack a sort of holistic human development perspective and orientation. I think the problems that we're wrestling with require often sort of intellectual border crossing, collaborations across disciplines, because we're trying to understand people's participation in very complex systems. And so I would hope that people who are sort of wrestling around in those sort of complex areas of working across intellectual boundaries would also think about putting together proposals for the conference in Chicago.